Here's something wild. There was this missile, they called it the Army's strategic weapon, and the Soviets, they were convinced it could hit Moscow, maybe even from underground bunkers in just minutes.
Right. And that fear, that mental image they had, it was potent.
But the funny thing is, their intel kind of blew its actual capabilities way out of proportion. Still, that fear, even if it was based on some shaky assumptions, it was a real factor.
Absolutely. That Soviet anxiety really frames the whole story of the Pershing II. And that's what we're diving into today, the Pershing II's weapon system.
Yeah, and we've got some great stuff to work with. You pulled together, well, everything from the official Army manual, FM 611, that gives us the real technical details, but also, Wikipedia for the broad strokes, even Reddit threads for some ground level takes.
Plus, insights from the National Air and Space Museum, articles from places like Air and Space Forces magazine, the veteran author, and then some heavier academic papers, historical docs about the INF Treaty. It's a good mix.
It really is. Different angles, right? Technical specs, Cold War strategy, even how people felt about it on the street.
Exactly. So our goal today is to kind of weave all that together, give everyone listening a clear, digestible picture of this, well, pretty significant piece of military tech and Cold War history.
Think of it as your shortcut to getting smart on the Pershing II. We'll hit the design, the deployment, the big strategic picture. Okay, so where did this thing even start? What was the genesis?
It kicks off back in 1973. The initial idea was just to update the Pershing 1A, which was already in service.
Okay, an upgrade. What needed upgrading?
Well, the Pershing 1A had a massive warhead, 400 kilotons. For the tactical jobs it was meant for, hitting hardened targets like bunkers, that was actually seen as, well, overkill.
Ah, so they weren't necessarily after more boom, but maybe more finesse,
Yeah,
a better aim.
precisely. The big push was for increased accuracy. The logic was, if you can hit the target dead on, you don't need such a huge warhead to take out something tough, like a reinforced bunker.
Makes sense. Get surgical.
Right. So Martin Marietta got the contract in 75, and by 77, they were doing development launches. The very first full-up launch was July 22nd, 1982, down at Cape Canaveral.
Okay, 82. And the warhead itself. I think there were options on the table.
Yeah, there were. The plan was for the W-85 warhead. This one was cool because it had a variable yield. You could dial the power up or down, anywhere from 5 kilotons up to 80.
Depending on the target, presumably.
Exactly. Now, there was also talk of a W-86 warhead. That one was designed to be an earth penetrator, burrow down before exploding.
Ooh, a bunker buster.
Right. But that W-86 got canceled in 1980, so every Pershing II that actually rolled off the line used that variable yield W-85.
Interesting how these concepts get explored and then sometimes shelved. Was anyone else interested in getting their hands on this early on?
Actually, yes. Israel put in a request to buy the Pershing II back in 1975.
Really?
Yeah, but that request was ultimately turned down. Various political and strategic reasons, I imagine.
Okay, so development's humming along, focused on this more accurate tactical role. But then, the Soviets make a move, right? Things change.
Things change big time. Starting in 1976, the Soviet Union starts deploying this new missile, the RSD-10 Pioneer. NATO called it the SS-20 Sabre.
And that was a problem.
A huge problem for NATO. The SS-20 had serious range, about 2,700 miles, and it carried two warheads, MIRVs, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles.
Two warheads, long range. That definitely ups the ante. How did the U.S. and NATO react?
Well, the SS-20 could hit pretty much anywhere in Western Europe from deep inside the Soviet Union. It was accurate, mobile, a real strategic threat, and this directly led to a shift in what the Pershing II needed to be.
Ah, so the requirements changed midstream.
Completely. Suddenly, that tactical focus wasn't enough. They needed range. The requirement jumped up to about 900 miles or 1,400 kilometers, enough to reach targets in Eastern Europe, maybe even the Western Soviet Union, to counter the SS-20 directly.
So it went from battlefield support to strategic counterpunch.
Exactly. It was even called Pershing Town Extended Range, PIIXR, for a while. This need for longer range was a driving force behind the NATO double-track decision in '79.
Right, the double-track decision. I remember that. What were the two tracks?
Track 1, deployment. NATO decided to deploy new intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe. That meant the Pershing II, with its new extended range, and also the BGM-109G ground-launched cruise missile, the GLCM, which flew lower and slower but had even longer range.
Okay, so build up the counterforce. What was track 2?
Diplomacy. Simultaneously pursue arms control talks with the Soviets. The idea was to show resolve and offer an off-ramp through negotiation Deploy while you talk.
A classic carrot and stick approach, sort of.
You could say that. Strengthen dialogue.
Now, I think I read about another warhead idea around this time, something non-nuclear, also canceled.
Yeah, good memory. In 1980, they looked at a kinetic energy penetrator. The idea was you wouldn't need an explosive warhead, just hit something like an airfield runway with a very fast, very dense projectile. Pure kinetic force does the damage.
Interesting concept.
It was, but like the W-86 Earth penetrator, it didn't make the cut. Stayed on the drawing board.
All right, so we've got the why, the Soviet SS-20 threat, the NATO response, the need for range. Let's get into the what. What was the Pershing test kit, technically speaking?
Okay, the missile itself. It was a two-stage, solid-fueled ballistic missile. Medium range.
Solid fuel, that's important, right? Faster launch.
Much faster. No need to pump liquid fuels right before launch, which took time and was dangerous. Solid fuel is stable, ready to go. Big advantage. Size-wise, it weighed just over 16,000 pounds, about 35 feet long, 40 inches diameter.
And the range, officially.
Officially 1,800 kilometers, which is about 1,100 miles.
But the Soviets thought more.
Yeah, as we said, their intel pegged it closer to 2,500 kilometers.
Mm.
The difference in perception was pretty significant strategically. It really fueled their fears.
Understandably. What about the construction? Anything special there?
Definitely. Both stages were made using Kevlar, the stuff in bulletproof vests.
Right, super strong, super light.
Exactly. Using Kevlar helped keep the weight down, which is crucial for getting good range and payload capacity. Really cutting-edge material for the time.
Okay, advanced materials. How did it steer? How did it get where it needed to go?
The propulsion and control were pretty clever. The first stage motor had a swivel nozzle.
Like on a jet engine, kinda?
Sort of, yeah. It could pivot the thrust to control pitch up and down and yaw left and right. For roll control, keeping it from spinning wildly, it used two movable air vanes on the first stage body during that initial burn.
Okay, so nozzle for big direction changes, vanes for stability.
Right. And then once the second stage took over and eventually the warhead, the re-entry vehicle, or RV, separated, roll control, was handled by vanes on the RV itself. The first stage also had two fixed vanes, just for extra aerodynamic stability while it was punching through the atmosphere. The Army manual, FM 611, actually has a nice diagram showing all this on the first stage.
A combination of thrust vectoring and fins. Makes sense. Now, the really critical part, the guidance. How did it achieve that pinpoint accuracy everyone talks about?
Yeah, the guidance was the secret sauce. It had a Singer-Kierkegaard Inertial Navigation System, or INS. Standard stuff. Uses gyros and accelerometers to keep track of where it is and where it's going. That handled the main flight path.
But that alone doesn't get you 30-meter accuracy, does it?
No, not usually.
Right.
The real game changer was the terminal guidance system, developed by Goodyear Aerospace. It used active radar guidance.
Active radar, so it's sending out signals.
Exactly. As it neared the target, the radar in the nose cone would scan the ground below. It would then compare the live radar picture it was getting back with digital reference scenes of the target area that were preloaded into its memory.
Like matching a photo.
A very sophisticated version of that, yeah. Think digital terrain matching. By comparing what it saw with what it expected to see based on the stored maps, it could figure out its position with incredible precision.
And that's how they got the CEP, circular error probable, down to 30 meters. About 100 feet.
That's the one. Which was revolutionary back then. Older missiles might have CEPs of hundreds of meters, maybe even a kilometer. 30 meters meant you could reliably hit very small, hardened targets with a relatively smaller warhead. Huge difference.
A real force multiplier. So it was constantly adjusting its path right up to the end based on this radar.
Pretty much, yeah. The INS laid the initial path, but the radar system provided continuous updates during that final dive. If the radar failed for some reason, the INS could still get it close, but you'd lose that pinpoint accuracy.
And inside the guidance section, what made it tick?
You had the Pershing Airborne Computer, the PA, doing the processing. A digital correlator unit, or DCU, did the heavy lifting of comparing the radar image to the stored scenes, and then actuators physically moved the control fins based on the computer's commands.
This radar matching system, I think it was called DSMC, Digital Scene Matching Area Correlator. Sounds complex. How did they get those reference scenes into the missile?
Good question. That data was critical. It had to be super accurate. It was loaded onto the missile before launch using data links. And because the RV would be coming down through different altitudes, the system actually stored 4 different sets of reference data.
4 maps for different heights.
Essentially, yeah. Each map was optimized for a specific altitude band, ensuring the radar correlation worked smoothly all the way down.
Clever. And where did these digital maps come from in the first place?
Goodyear also built something called the Reference Scene Generation Facility, or RSGF. This was basically a big truck-mounted shelter, a mobile unit,
A map-making truck?
pretty much. Inside, it had the computers, a DEC PDP 1170, specifically, and equipment needed to process radar imagery of potential target areas and turn it into those digital reference scenes.
Oh.
Yeah, this data, drawn from a larger operational database, ODB, with elevation and terrain info, was loaded onto these special quarter-inch tape cartridges. Rugged little things. Before launch, you'd plug this cartridge into the launcher control panel, and that would program the missile's guidance system with the target data.
So the targeting info came on a physical cartridge.
Right. Managed by the battalion's targeting section, stored securely in the field, probably in something called a portable control center, or PCC. The whole process was quite involved.
The logistics sound intense. Okay, so they figured out how to build it, how to target it, where did they actually put these things, and who operated them?
Right, deployment. The U.S. Army started swapping out their old Pershing IAs for the Pershing II, starting in 1983.
What about the Germans? They had Pershing 1As too, right?
They did. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, held on to their 1As. They actually kept them right up until 1991, when all Pershings were eliminated under the INF Treaty. The whole program was managed by the U.S. Army Missile Command, MICOM, but the guys on the ground doing the deploying and operating were from the Field Artillery Branch.
And they went to Europe as part of that NATO decision.
Yep, specifically Western Europe, as the counter to the SS-20. In the end, 108 Pershing II launchers were deployed over there.
108, and these launchers weren't just sitting ducks, were they? They were mobile.
Highly mobile. The launcher, missile, generator, and crane were all mounted on heavy trucks. The U.S. units used the M9A3 HEMTT truck, big 8-wheeled beast, came with a high-ab crane and a 30-kilowatt generator.
Okay.
The German units used a different prime mover, an M1001 tractor made by MAN, also with a crane, an Atlas this time, and a similar generator.
So they could move around. How quickly could they set up?
Very quickly. A key feature was the self-orienting guidance system. It could figure out its own alignment. This meant they could launch from pretty much any pre-surveyed spot in minutes, didn't need a fixed, prepared launch pad. Huge advantage for survivability shoot and scoot.
Makes them much harder to find and target. Now, thinking about those field units, what did a typical Pershing II battery look like, organizationally?
According to the FM 611 manual, a firing battery was the basic unit. You'd have firing platoons, obviously the guys who actually launched the missiles. Then an operations and communications platoon handling mission control and talking to higher HQs. A support platoon took care of logistics, fuel, food, ammo, parts, and of course battery headquarters.
A self-contained little army, almost. What about keeping things running? Maintenance.
Day-to-day stuff was handled within the battery, the motor sergeant, the battalion maintenance section. For bigger jobs, there was a forward support company that provided intermediate-level maintenance. Each battery also had its own recovery vehicles, 3 of them usually, to haul broken-down trucks or equipment, and they had planned logistics sites, raid sites, for getting resupplied.
Sounds well thought out for field operations. Now, the elephant in the room, nuclear warheads, security must have been off the charts.
Absolutely paramount. Extremely strict controls. Everything flowed down from the National Command Authority, the president, basically, through the Joint Chiefs. On the ground, the absolute bedrock was the 2-man rule.
2 people needed for everything sensitive.
Always. No single person could ever have access to nuclear components or critical procedures alone. They also had specific, rigorous procedures for the Safeguard and Arming System, SAS, and the Permissive Action Link, PAL.
KL codes.
Yeah.
Those are the launch authorization codes, right?
Exactly. Designed to prevent any unauthorized launch. Everyone involved had intense, continuous training on nuclear security. Any violation, however small it seemed, had to be reported immediately, no exceptions. They even had plans for emergency destruction of sensitive crypto gear, co-MSE set stuff, if they were about to be overrun.
Total lockdown. What about protecting the soldiers themselves, radiation, other threats?
Yeah, safety was key too.
Yeah.
There were strict limits on radiation exposure for personnel working near the weapons. And given the context, NBC Defense Nuclear Biological Chemical was drilled constantly. Decontamination procedures, from quick emergency decon to thorough cleaning, were standard practice.
And keeping secrets.
Huge emphasis on that, protecting essential elements of friendly information, or EFI. Basically, don't let the enemy know anything important about your capabilities, locations, or plans. Loose lips sink ships, especially nuclear-armed ones.
Okay, intense security, robust field setup. Let's walk through a launch. What happens from countdown to impact?
All right. Before launch, the gyro compass system on the missile gets aligned. Gets its precise starting direction, its azimuth. Launch command comes down.
Big move.
Mission. War.
Boy.
Big time. Solid rocket motors fire. The missile heads up, guided initially just by its inertial system. That INS keeps it on the calculated trajectory until the warhead, the RV, separates from the second stage way up high.
And steering during that boost phase.
That's the swivel nozzle on the first stage controlling pitch and yaw, and those small air vanes handling roll. Same basic principle for the second stage.
Okay, stages burn out, RV separates, now it's coasting.
Sort of. It enters the mid-course phase.
Mm.
Right after separation, the RV actually pitches its nose down. This helps with the re-entry angle, and it also makes it a smaller target on enemy radar.
Sneaky.
While it's up there, briefly outside the main atmosphere, little thrusters, a reaction control system help keep it oriented. Then as it starts to come back down into the thicker air, its own control vanes take over steering.
And then the grand finale, the terminal phase.
Right. As it gets close, maybe the last minute or so, the INS might command a slight adjustment to control its final speed. Then, the key part, the Goodyear active radar seeker switches on.
Starts scanning the ground.
Yep. Scans the target area, compares what it sees to those stored digital maps in its memory, the DSMA system working its magic. It calculates any difference between where it is and where it should be.
And tells the fins what to do.
Exactly. The guidance computer sends commands to the RV's control vanes, making those final, precise adjustments to steer it right onto the target. Boom. The FM 611 manual actually has a really good diagram, figure 1 to 9, showing that whole sequence visually.
Incredible technology. But deploying something like this in Europe, it wasn't exactly popular everywhere, was it? There were protests.
Oh, massive protests.
Yeah.
Huge. Deploying Pershing II and the GLCMs ignited a firestorm of opposition across Western Europe, and in the U.S. too. Groups like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, C&D, were very, very active.
I remember seeing pictures, huge crowds.
Yeah, giant demonstrations in cities like Bonn, the West German capital then. And the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common Air Base in the UK became this really iconic, long-running protest against the cruise missiles deployed there. But symbolic of the whole anti-nuclear movement, it tapped into deep public fears about nuclear war.
Was it just marches and camps? Or did it get more intense?
It went further. In West Germany, people took the government to court, arguing that deploying these missiles violated the German constitution, the basic law, saying it was preparation for an offensive war.
Did that work?
Ultimately, no. The courts didn't block the deployment. But then you had groups like the Plowshares movement. They took more direct action.
What did they do?
They would break into facilities, places where components were made, like Avco in Massachusetts or Martin Marietta down in Florida. They'd sometimes damage equipment, pour blood on things, symbolic acts against the weapons. They even did actions at deployment sites in Germany. The Reddit discussions we looked at really capture some of that strong feeling, that controversy.
So a really divisive time, lots of fear, lots of anger. And didn't something actually go wrong at one point? An accident in Germany?
Yes, unfortunately. The Heilbronn motor fire, January 1985. It definitely didn't help calm public nerves.
What happened?
They were taking a first-stage rocket motor out of its shipping container. The investigation concluded that static electricity built up, probably friction, between the motor casing and the foam padding inside the container.
A static spark.
Barely. It ignited the solid propellant, caused massive pressure buildup, ruptured the motor case, the nozzle blew off. A real mess.
Did anyone hurt? Was there nuclear material involved?
Thankfully, no nuclear material was involved in that incident. It was just the motor. But several soldiers were killed and injured. It was a tragedy, and it absolutely fueled more protests and raised serious safety questions. After that, they actually added ballistic shields around the missile stages on the launchers as an extra precaution.
Wow. A sobering reminder of the dangers, even without the warhead involved. Okay, let's shift back to the Soviets. We mentioned they overestimated the range. Did they misunderstand other things too?
Yeah, that perception gap was critical. Besides thinking it could fly much farther, reaching Moscow, which it couldn't from West Germany, they were also convinced it carried that W-86 Earth-penetrating warhead we talked about earlier.
Even though it was canceled.
Even though it was canceled.
Yeah.
So in their minds, you had this super accurate missile that they thought had extra long range and could dig down to destroy their deepest command bunkers.
That sounds like a recipe for paranoia.
Exactly. It created this intense fear of a decapitation strike, a surprise attack that could take out their leadership and ability to respond, potentially in just minutes of flight time. Even though the reality was different, that fear was a major driver in Soviet strategic thinking and their hostility towards the deployment.
Misinformation and fear as strategic factors. Scary stuff. Now, were there other Pershing variants? besides the 1A and the second?
A few were considered or partially developed. There was the Pershing 1B. This was basically a Pershing II missile using only its first stage.
Shorter range.
Right, about the same range as the original Pershing 1A. The idea was that maybe the German Air Force could use the 1B to replace their 1As, getting the newer tech, but staying within treaty limits on range for German missiles at the time.
Did that happen?
No, because the Germans eventually agreed to get rid of their 1As entirely as part of the INF deal. But the Pershing II launcher could handle the shorter 1B missile, and they actually used the 1B for some test launches stateside, mainly because places like White Sands Missile Range didn't have enough room to test the full-range Pershing II.
Okay, so 1B was a real thing, just never deployed operationally. Anything else?
There was a concept called Pershing II Reduced Range, or RR,
Yeah.
that would have modified the launcher to carry two of those single-stage 1B missiles, double the firepower, shorter reach, never built, and then way down the line, the name Pershing III popped up.
A whole new generation.
Well, it was proposed for a couple of different things. First, as a much larger four-stage missile, maybe to replace the big ICBMs like the Peacekeeper. Later, the Pershing III name was floated for a coastal defense anti-ship missile.
Did either of those go anywhere?
Nope. Neither Pershing III concept ever got off the ground, so to speak.
So Pershing II was the end of the line, operationally. But its story definitely didn't end with deployment. It became central to a huge arms control treaty, didn't it?
Absolutely. Remember the NATO double-track decision. Track 2 was always arms control. The deployment of Pershing II, the cruise missiles put immense pressure on the Soviets. And crucially, the West German chancellor at the time, Helmut Kohl, made a key pledge.
What was that?
He promised that West Germany would unilaterally dismantle its shorter-range Pershing 1A missiles if the U.S. and the Soviets agreed to scrap all their intermediate-range missiles, the ones covered by the negotiations.
That must have helped negotiations.
Big time. It removed a potential sticking point. And all this culminated in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty,
Right.
the INF Treaty signed in 1987 by Reagan and Gorbachev.
A landmark treaty. What did it do?
It was huge. It eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. All ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. That meant all U.S. Pershing tillers and GLCMs had to go, and all Soviet SS-20s, SS-4s, SS-5s, and even some shorter-range systems like the SS-12 and SS-23.
Complete elimination.
Complete elimination of those categories. By 1991, all the Pershing tillers, their launchers, all the support gear gone. Destroyed according to treaty protocols.
Wow. What did they actually do with the dismantled missiles? Melt them down?
Pretty much. And interestingly, some of the scrap metal from both the Pershing tillers and the Soviet SS-20s was actually used to make commemorative items.
Like souvenirs.
Sort of, yeah. A charity, Leonard Cheshire's World Memorial Fund for Disaster Relief, sold badges made from the metal. Parker Pen even made a series of pens using the scrap material, with proceeds going to the charity. They gave a set to the 5 living former U.S. presidents when the Reagan Library opened.
Turning swords into plowshares. Or pens, anyway.
A symbolic gesture, definitely. From weapons of potential annihilation to objects of commemoration and charity.
So the Pershing II itself is gone, consigned to history by the INF Treaty. But what's its lasting significance? How should we remember it?
Well, during its relatively short deployment life, it was the U.S. Army's main nuclear theater weapon. Its deployment was arguably one of the peak points of tension in the later Cold War, but its existence also became a critical bargaining chip that led to a major arms control success. Technologically, its accuracy was a massive leap forward, and you still have veterans groups today keeping the history alive.
But the treaty that eliminated it,
Yeah.
the INF Treaty, that's not history anymore, is it? It's current events?
Tragically, no. The INF Treaty, hailed for decades as a cornerstone of arms control, is gone. The U.S. withdrew in 2019.
Why?
The official U.S. reason was persistent Russian violations of the treaty, specifically their development and fielding of a new ground-launched cruise missile, the 9M729, which the U.S. stated fell within the banned range category. Russia denied the violation, and after the U.S. withdrawal, they withdrew too.
So the treaty collapsed. What does that mean now?
It means that whole class of missiles, intermediate-range ground-launched systems, is no longer banned for the U.S. or Russia. It opens the door for new deployments. And this is happening in a world that's arguably more complex than the Cold War, with China possessing a large arsenal of exactly these kinds of missiles, which were never covered by the INF Treaty because China wasn't part of it.
So we're potentially seeing a new missile race in this category.
It's a serious concern. The 2018 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review already talked about developing new systems, partly in response to the INF situation. Things like new low-yield submarine-launched weapons, potentially a new sea-launched cruise missile, and even exploring, ironically, a new ground-launched intermediate-range cruise missile. It echoes the GLCM from the 80s.
History repeating itself, but with different players and maybe even higher stakes.
It feels that way sometimes. The whole INF saga, from its creation driven by Pershing II and the SS-20 to its demise, really highlight how difficult arms control is in a multipolar world with rapidly changing technology, things like hypersonic weapons, advanced drones, AI stuff that wasn't even on the radar when INF was signed.
And the psychological impact, the fear factor we started with.
Still relevant.
Mhm.
Deploying these kinds of missiles creates anxiety, raises tensions within alliances, affects public perception, just like in the 1980s. Understanding the Pershing II story, its tech, its politics, the treaty it led to, and why that treaty failed, it gives us really valuable context for the challenges we're facing right now with nuclear strategy and arms control.
It really does tie it all together. Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. For everyone listening, if you had to boil it down, what are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive?
Key takeaways, I'd say. One, the Pershing Goblet was a technological marvel for its time, especially its accuracy. Two, its deployment was a pivotal, highly controversial moment in the Cold War, escalating tensions but also enabling diplomacy. Three, the public reaction against it was massive and reflected real nuclear anxieties. And four, its elimination under the INF Treaty was a huge arms control victory. But the treaty's recent collapse brings those dangers right back to the forefront, complicating today's global security. It's a story of technology, strategy, fear, and diplomacy with echoes we hear very clearly today.
Definitely a richer picture than just Cold War missile. It really does make you think with the INF treaty gone. What comes next? Are we heading back towards a Europe bristling with intermediate range missiles? Or can diplomacy find a new path? Yeah, that's a heavy thought to end on.
It is. And for listeners who want to explore that, you could look into the current debates on nuclear deterrence, the status of talks between the U.S., Russia, and maybe China, or even the new missile technologies being developed. Organizations focused on arms control put out a lot of good analysis, and museums like the Air and Space Museum offer great historical context.
Excellent places to continue the journey. Well, a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the Pershing II. We hope it's given you a clearer understanding of this complex weapon and its enduring legacy.